At first glance, Claire and Ryan Dawson seemed to have it all. They were the golden couple of their quiet suburban neighborhood in Seattle. Ryan, a successful financial analyst with a sharp mind, and Claire, a creative and talented freelance graphic designer, lived in a beautiful two-story home nestled on a peaceful street. They hosted barbecues, attended community charity events, and jogged together every morning, displaying the perfect image of marital bliss. To anyone looking in, their life was a dream come true. But as with all illusions, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Ryan's charm and wit made him a favorite at social gatherings, and Claire's warm smile and artistic abilities won the affection of everyone she met. Yet, behind their flawless public persona, the first signs of trouble began to appear. At first, it was just the small things. Ryan would leave his clothes scattered around the house, while Claire would complain about his lack of participation in household chores. But these little disagreements, seemingly trivial at the time, slowly began to chip away at their once perfect relationship. Claire, always the supportive wife, tried to brush off the little annoyances. It was just part of marriage, she thought. But the tension continued to build, and as the months passed, the arguments escalated. What was once just about laundry and groceries became heated debates over finances, time management, and even Claire's friendships. But to the outside world, everything still appeared perfect. They posted loving pictures on social media, celebrated anniversaries with lavish dinners, and posted heartfelt messages about their love for each other. They even attended couples therapy to work on their issues, yet behind closed doors, their marriage was crumbling. It wasn't long before Claire began to feel trapped, unable to voice her true feelings. Ryan, the man she once admired and loved, had transformed into someone she feared. He had become more controlling, dictating everything from what she wore to whom she could see. Claire felt as though she was losing herself, caught in a web of his demands. Yet, when they were in public, no one suspected the growing darkness between them. Ryan was no longer the man she had fallen in love with. He was a stranger. A stranger who controlled every aspect of her life, and as the months went by, Claire began to withdraw. She stopped seeing her friends, canceling plans under the guise of being too busy. The bright, independent woman she once was now a shadow of herself. Claire confided in her best friend, Grace, but even Grace seemed to misunderstand her. "Maybe you're just overreacting," she'd say. "All couples go through rough patches." But for Claire, this was no longer just a rough patch. This was something deeper, something darker. Something she could no longer ignore. Yet, even when the truth was clear to her, Claire found herself stuck in a cycle of fear and denial. She still loved Ryan. She believed that if she could just love him more, if she could somehow meet all of his expectations, he would change. But no amount of love seemed to make a difference. The more Claire tried, the more Ryan demanded. And soon, she realized that her happiness, her peace, and even her sense of self had been slowly drained from her. It wasn't until one evening that Claire realized just how far Ryan's control had stretched. After a seemingly harmless argument about money, Ryan became unreasonably angry. His anger was swift and sharp, and for the first time, Claire saw something in his eyes, a darkness she hadn't seen before. His words cut deep, and his harsh tone made Claire's stomach turn. What had once been a disagreement over household matters had turned into a power struggle, a fight that Claire was losing, without even realizing it. That night, after the argument subsided, Claire tried to push the feeling of dread away. But she couldn't shake it. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks: this wasn't just a phase. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was something much worse. And the more she thought about it, the more she saw the truth. Ryan wasn't just difficult to live with, he was controlling. And worse still, he was abusive. She knew she had to get out. But the thought of leaving him terrified her. Where would she go? What would she do? Could she really leave behind everything she had known, everything she had worked for? Could she risk losing everything? The more she thought about it, the more the walls seemed to close in. The weight of the realization grew heavier and heavier, as if the air itself was thick with the weight of her fear. As Claire lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she felt a chilling truth sink into her bones. She was no longer safe. Ryan had never been the man she thought he was. The perfect life they once had was a lie, a facade that had now shattered, leaving only the harsh, painful truth behind. And she was trapped inside it. But even in the deepest moments of fear, Claire began to gather the strength to fight back. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when there was a chance, just a small chance, that she could escape. But how? And where would she go? The answers wouldn't come easy. But one thing was clear: if she was going to survive, she would need to break free from Ryan's grip. And the journey to freedom would not be simple. It would be a battle, one she wasn't sure she was strong enough to fight. But for the first time in a long time, Claire felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way out. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Claire's life became a constant balancing act. The cracks in her marriage to Ryan, once barely noticeable, were now impossible to ignore. Every argument, every disagreement, grew more intense. What had once been small disagreements, about household chores, money, or time management, was now full-blown conflicts. Ryan had begun to exert more control over her every move, and Claire was starting to feel the suffocating weight of it all. At first, Claire had tried to downplay the changes in their relationship. She told herself that every couple went through tough times, that things would get better with a little patience. But the more she tried to keep the peace, the worse things seemed to get. Ryan was no longer the man who had swept her off her feet. He was distant, condescending, and demanding. The first sign of trouble had been subtle. Ryan would make little comments about how Claire dressed, or how she spent her free time. At first, it was harmless. A suggestion here, a criticism there. But soon, those little comments turned into outright demands. Ryan insisted on knowing where Claire was at all times. If she spent too long talking to a friend, he'd accuse her of neglecting him. If she worked late on a project, he'd call her multiple times, questioning why she hadn't come home yet. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Claire sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen. She was deep into a freelance project, her mind racing with ideas. She didn't hear Ryan approach until his shadow fell across her desk. "Are you still working?" he asked, his voice low and icy. Claire looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him come in. "Yes, just finishing a few things." Ryan stared at her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You spend too much time on this," he said, his tone sharp. "You need to learn how to manage your priorities, Claire. You can't keep neglecting your responsibilities here at home." Claire felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest. She hadn't neglected anything. She was just trying to finish her work before dinner. But she knew arguing would only escalate the situation, so she bit her lip and nodded. "I'll be done in a few minutes," she said quietly, trying to keep the peace. But Ryan wasn't done. "You think I'm stupid? You've been working all night on this nonsense while I've been sitting here waiting. You never listen to me, Claire. You always put everything else before me." The words cut deep, but Claire held her ground. "I'm not putting you last," she said, though her voice wavered. "I just need some space to work." Ryan stepped closer, his presence now filling the room. "You think you can just do whatever you want? I've been patient, but you don't appreciate me, do you?" Claire felt the tension building, the familiar feeling of walking on eggshells taking over. Her pulse quickened. She knew this pattern all too well. The passive-aggressive comments, the guilt trips, the way Ryan made her feel like she was never enough. And yet, she didn't know how to make it stop. "I do appreciate you, Ryan," Claire said, her voice trembling. "But I need some space to work. You can't control everything I do." Ryan's eyes flared with anger. He leaned in, his breath hot against her face. "You think I'm controlling? I'm just trying to help you see what's really important. If you don't get your priorities straight, we're going to have a problem." Claire's heart raced. This wasn't a conversation anymore, it was an ultimatum. She tried to steady her breathing, but she couldn't help feeling trapped. Ryan's demands were relentless, and it was starting to wear her down. Later that night, Claire lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. Ryan was asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. But Claire couldn't sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about the argument, the way Ryan had cornered her, how he made her feel small. She wasn't allowed to have a voice, not really. Everything she did was scrutinized, controlled, criticized. She turned to face him, watching his peaceful expression in the dark. How did it come to this? She wondered. She had once admired him, loved him deeply. But now? Now, she felt like she was drowning, unable to breathe under the weight of his expectations. The next few days were filled with more of the same. Ryan became even more controlling, subtly but constantly reminding Claire of her supposed shortcomings. If she went out with friends, he'd criticize her for spending time away from him. If she wanted to work on a project, he'd accuse her of ignoring their marriage. Everything was a test, a challenge, a demand that Claire never seemed able to meet. One afternoon, as Claire was on a video call with Grace, she caught a glimpse of Ryan standing in the hallway, watching her with a cold, unreadable expression. Grace noticed Claire's shift in demeanor and quickly ended the conversation. "Is everything okay?" Grace asked, concern in her voice. Claire tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just tired. I'll talk to you later." But as she ended the call, Claire knew deep down that she couldn't keep pretending. She couldn't keep living in this suffocating, toxic environment. Ryan's control had crossed a line, and she had let it happen. Later that evening, after another tense dinner, Claire found herself standing in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. "Who am I becoming?" she thought. This wasn't the woman she once was, the confident, independent woman with big dreams. She was slowly losing herself, piece by piece, in Ryan's grip. That night, as Claire lay awake, she felt the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. She had allowed Ryan's behavior to dictate her life for too long. She had been too afraid to stand up for herself. But now, something was changing inside her. The truth was undeniable. She couldn't keep living like this. Claire didn't know what her next step would be, but one thing was clear: she couldn't go on like this. The first step to breaking free had already begun. She was no longer willing to silence herself to appease Ryan. The tension between them had reached its breaking point, and Claire could no longer ignore the reality of her situation. The battle was about to begin, and Claire knew she would need all her strength to fight for the life she deserved. The question was, would she be strong enough to break free from the chains Ryan had wrapped around her? The night everything changed came without warning, but it was inevitable. The tension had been building for weeks, maybe even months, between Claire and Ryan. He had grown more demanding, more controlling, and Claire, for the most part, had been quietly enduring it. She had tried to reason with herself, told herself that things would get better. But deep down, she knew that something was wrong. Ryan had begun to raise his voice more often, belittling her in front of friends and family, pushing her further into a corner where she felt like she had no voice. The small criticisms had turned into harsh accusations. He would accuse her of being lazy when she rested, selfish when she spent time with friends, and ungrateful when she took a moment for herself. She felt trapped, suffocated, and ashamed of the woman she had become under his control. That night, it started like any other. They had just finished dinner, and Claire was clearing the table. Ryan sat on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone, his mood unusually tense. Claire noticed it but didn't say anything. She knew better than to speak when he was in one of those moods. But she was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending everything was fine, exhausted from constantly walking on eggshells. As she placed the last dish into the sink, she felt a shift in the air. Ryan's voice cut through the silence. "You're always busy with something, aren't you?" His tone was sharp, laced with annoyance. Claire froze, her hands still wet from washing the dishes. "I'm just cleaning up," she replied quietly, trying to keep her voice calm. "No," Ryan shot back, his voice rising. "You're always cleaning up. You never have time for me, for us. You always put your work and your friends before me." Claire turned to face him, trying to keep her composure. "Ryan, I'm not putting you last. I'm just—" Before she could finish, Ryan was on his feet, his expression twisted with anger. "You don't get it, do you? You don't care about me at all." Claire's heart raced. She had seen him angry before, but something felt different this time. The air around them was thick with tension, a storm ready to break. "Ryan, please," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly, "we're just arguing over something small." "No," Ryan snapped. "This is not something small. You never listen to me. You never care about what I need." In a flash, he was standing in front of her, his face inches from hers, his chest heaving with anger. Claire tried to step back, but Ryan grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unrelenting. The room seemed to shrink as the pressure mounted. Claire's mind raced. This isn't happening. This isn't real. But it was. His grip tightened, and Claire winced in pain, struggling to pull away. "You're not going anywhere," Ryan snarled, his voice low and threatening. The words cut through her like a knife, and for the first time, Claire realized that she was no longer just in an emotionally abusive relationship. This was physical. This was dangerous. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, but she didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. What could she say to him? How had it come to this? This man, the man she had married, was now a stranger, a man capable of violence, of cruelty. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to run, but her body was frozen. She had always been afraid of confrontation, afraid of upsetting Ryan. But now, something had shifted inside her. She couldn't just stand there and let this happen. She mustered every ounce of strength and, with all her might, shoved him off her. He stumbled back, surprised by the force of her push. But instead of retreating, he lunged forward, grabbing her again, this time by the shoulders. His grip was stronger now, his eyes wild with rage. Claire's heart pounded as she struggled to break free. She could feel the heat of his anger, the rage burning through him, but in that moment, something clicked. "I'm not afraid anymore," she thought. "I won't let him control me." With all her strength, Claire pushed him again, harder this time, using her body's instinct to break free. Ryan staggered back, his face contorted in disbelief. Claire didn't wait. She ran. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she had to get away. She ran out the door into the cold night air, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her chest tightening with panic. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. Her only thought was to get away from him, to break free from the prison she had been living in for so long. As she ran down the street, Claire's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The adrenaline surged through her, but beneath it all, she felt a strange sense of relief. She was alive. She was free. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she realized she had a choice. She didn't have to live like this. Her heart still raced, and her thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear: this was the turning point. She had taken the first step. Claire had awakened, and she was ready to fight for her freedom. The days following Violet's realization were a blur of emotions. Her mind raced with thoughts of leaving Ryan, but her heart felt like it was being weighed down by 1,000 invisible chains. Each time she tried to focus, the fear would come rushing back. What if I can't do it? What if he finds out? She had never imagined that things would come to this. But she couldn't go on living like this. The lies, the control, the isolation, everything had built up to this unbearable point. The woman who once was confident, independent, and in control of her own life now felt like a shell of herself, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. For days, Violet had been wrestling with her own thoughts. She couldn't let this continue. She couldn't let Ryan destroy her spirit. But she also knew that leaving wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about packing up her things and walking out the door. No, Ryan's grip on her was too tight, his presence too overwhelming. She needed a plan. That evening, as Ryan came home late from work, Violet quietly slipped into the spare room, away from his prying eyes. She sat at the desk, the dim light casting shadows across her face. The first thing she did was take out her phone and searched for help. She had heard of domestic violence hotlines, but had always been too scared to call. Tonight, however, she needed to take action. With trembling hands, she dialed the number of a local domestic violence support hotline. The voice on the other end was calm and kind, offering a sense of relief Violet hadn't felt in months. "We're here for you," the counselor said, listening intently as Violet poured out her fears and feelings of helplessness. She was surprised by how easy it was to speak to someone who didn't judge her, someone who understood the depth of the situation. Violet was given information on how to create a safety plan, how to gather important documents, and where she could go for shelter. For the first time in a long time, Violet felt like she wasn't alone in this. She had a way out. That night, after Ryan had fallen asleep on the couch, his usual spot where he'd drink too much and pass out, Violet went into their bedroom and took the first step in her plan. She quietly opened the drawer, retrieving her passport, some cash she'd been hiding, and her ID. Her heart was pounding, her body shaking with fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't let Ryan find out. She couldn't let him stop her now. But as she packed her things, Violet felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Am I doing the right thing? She wondered. She had spent years loving Ryan. She had fought to keep their marriage intact, even when it had been falling apart. Leaving him felt like a betrayal of everything they had once been. But then, the weight of the fear she had been living under for so long pushed away all doubts. She couldn't stay. She wouldn't stay. She wasn't going to let Ryan keep controlling her life. The next morning, Violet did something she hadn't done in years. She made the decision to speak to her sister, Rachel, the one person she had been hiding things from for far too long. Rachel had always been the supportive sibling, the one who knew Violet's deepest fears. But even with Rachel, Violet had kept the truth about her marriage hidden. Sitting in the kitchen, trying to calm her nerves, Violet finally told Rachel everything. She spoke in a whisper, fearing that Ryan could hear her from the other room, but her words came out in a flood. She talked about the emotional abuse, the control, the isolation, and the fear that had taken over her life. Rachel was stunned into silence at first, then, slowly, her face filled with shock, then anger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You don't have to stay in this, Violet. You deserve so much better. We'll get you out of here." But even Rachel's support, while comforting, wasn't enough to ease the fear Violet felt. What if Ryan found out? What if he punished her for even thinking about leaving? The next few days felt like a blur. Violet continued to prepare in secret, making arrangements with a nearby women's shelter. She opened a hidden savings account, stashing away any spare money she could. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Every moment was filled with anxiety. How long could she keep this up without Ryan finding out? And then, one fateful afternoon, her worst fear happened. Ryan found the notes she had hidden, notes with the address to the shelter, with instructions on how to escape. She had forgotten to hide them well enough. Ryan stormed into the living room, his face red with rage. He waved the papers in the air, his voice rising with fury. "So this is what you've been planning behind my back?" he shouted. "You think you can just leave me? You think I'll let you get away?" Violet's heart skipped a beat. She was paralyzed with fear, her mind racing for an answer, but none came. Ryan was right there, his anger boiling over. He advanced toward her, grabbing her by the arm, shaking her violently. "You're not going anywhere," he spat. But something inside Violet shifted. She was no longer the frightened woman she had been. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. With all the strength she could muster, Violet yanked herself free from his grasp. She ran, not knowing where to go, but knowing she had to leave before it was too late. As she fled the house, her heart was pounding in her chest, but her mind was clear. She had taken the first step. It was going to be hard. She didn't know where she'd go next, but for the first time, she felt the spark of hope. Violet's heart raced as she stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the handle of the suitcase that held everything she needed to leave. It was surreal. The world around her felt like it was moving in slow motion, as though she was on the edge of something too big to comprehend. Every step she had taken to prepare for this moment led her to this door, this moment when she would finally escape the prison that had been her marriage. Her palms were sweating as she turned to take one last look at the house she had once called home. The house that was now a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. She knew it was time to leave, but as the door clicked shut behind her, a wave of doubt rushed over her. "What if I'm making a mistake?" she thought. "What if it's worse out there?" But there was no turning back now. She had made the decision. This was the only way forward. Violet took a deep breath and stepped out into the cold, dark night. The air was crisp, and the street was eerily quiet. She hurried down the path, her footsteps muffled by the soft thud of her shoes on the pavement. Her breath came out in small clouds of vapor, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't dare look behind her. Every second felt like an eternity, and she knew she had to get away before he noticed. But as she reached the end of the driveway, she heard it. The sound of a car door slamming. Violet froze, her heart dropping into her stomach. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body didn't respond. She turned slowly, her eyes widening in panic as Ryan's car came into view. He had seen her. He was coming after her. In an instant, Violet's fear turned to adrenaline. She ran. She didn't look back. The fear of being caught, the fear of what Ryan would do to her, pushed her forward faster than she had ever run in her life. She knew the street well, there was a small alley just ahead that would take her toward the bus stop. She had to make it there. But as she rounded the corner, she heard the screech of tires and the roar of Ryan's car engine. He was right behind her. No, not now. Please, not now, she thought desperately, but her legs carried her forward, faster, harder. Her breaths were coming in ragged gasps. Her mind was a blur of panic. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to keep running. She could hear the engine grow louder, closer. Ryan was gaining on her. She had to think fast. The alley was too narrow, and the bus stop was still too far away. In a moment of panic, Violet spotted an open gate to a neighbor's backyard. She darted toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed through the gate and ducked down behind the garden shed, trying to catch her breath. The darkness hid her, but it also trapped her. If Ryan found her here, there would be nowhere to go. She held her breath, praying that he wouldn't see her, praying that he would drive past. But then, she heard it. The screech of his tires as he slammed on the brakes, followed by the sound of the car door opening. Ryan was here. Violet's pulse spiked as she crouched behind the shed, her body trembling. She could hear Ryan's footsteps now, slow and deliberate, as he moved toward the backyard. He was searching for her. "Violet." Ryan's voice called out, rough with anger. "I know you're here. You can't run from me. You never could." The words pierced her like a dagger. The man she had once loved, the man who had promised to protect her, was now the one hunting her down like an animal. Every part of her wanted to scream, to fight, but she knew that if she made a sound, it would be over. "Think, Violet. Think." She urged herself. She had to make it to the bus. It was her only chance. If she could just get to the bus station, she would be safe. In the distance, she heard the sound of a car speeding away. Had Ryan left? Had he given up? No. "Don't be stupid, Violet. He's just gone to look for you somewhere else. Don't wait around," she told herself. With one final breath, Violet stood up, heart hammering in her chest. She didn't care about the noise she made now. She bolted for the alley, her legs moving faster than they had ever moved before. She didn't look back. Not once. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she rounded the corner and saw the bus stop just ahead. Her mind felt like it was on fire with adrenaline. She was almost there. She could see the bus lights in the distance. Then, a shout cut through the night. "Violet!" It was Ryan. He had caught up to her. In that moment, Violet knew that there was no turning back. She had to face him now. She couldn't let him follow her anymore. She couldn't keep running. Ryan lunged at her, his hand grabbing her wrist in a brutal grip. Violet screamed, trying to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming. He shoved her against a nearby wall, his breath hot and heavy on her face. "You think you can just leave me?" Ryan snarled. "You're mine, Violet. You're not going anywhere." The rage in his eyes sent a shiver of fear down her spine, but Violet didn't flinch. She had already decided. She wasn't going back. She wouldn't be his prisoner anymore. With everything she had left in her, Violet twisted her body and drove her knee into Ryan's stomach. He grunted, stumbling backward, and for the first time in a long time, Violet had a moment of freedom. She ran, not looking back this time. She could hear Ryan shouting after her, but it didn't matter. Violet made it to the bus stop, her heart pounding in her chest. The bus was waiting. The doors opened, and without thinking, Violet stepped inside. The doors closed behind her, and she was finally free. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Violet looked out the window, the tears finally starting to fall. She was scared. She was exhausted. But she was free. For the first time in years, she could breathe. The bus rumbled down the highway, taking Violet further and further from the man she had once loved, the man who had held her captive for so long. As the lights of her neighborhood faded into the distance, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. She had spent so many months in a constant state of fear, anxiety, and anger that now, with every passing mile, her body began to release the tension she had been holding onto for so long. But as the bus pulled farther from the life she had known, Violet's mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She was free, yes, but that freedom came with a heavy weight. She was scared, uncertain of what awaited her. Would she be safe? Could she ever rebuild her life? Would Ryan find her, and would he come after her? The questions spun in her head like a whirlwind, each one more terrifying than the last. The fear that had been a constant companion was now accompanied by guilt. Had she done the right thing? Was leaving him, betraying everything they once were, the right choice? Her heart ached with the knowledge that she had loved Ryan once, deeply. She had loved him with everything she had. But now, she was forced to face the ugly truth, that the man she loved had never been the man she thought he was. He had never truly loved her. His love was twisted, controlling, suffocating, and ultimately, destructive. Violet's mind drifted back to the moments leading up to her escape. The violence, the shouting, the manipulation. Ryan had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The realization hit her harder now that she was away from him. He had stolen pieces of her, little by little, until she didn't recognize herself. She had lost her voice, her identity, and most painfully, her sense of self-worth. But as she sat on that bus, staring out the window at the endless road ahead, Violet realized something that shook her to her core. She had found the strength to walk away. She hadn't let him destroy her completely. Despite everything, she was still here. She was still alive. She was still Violet, not the woman he had tried to break, not the woman he had tried to control, but a woman who had found the courage to survive. Her eyes welled up with tears, not of sadness, but of a bittersweet relief. She wasn't just escaping Ryan, she was reclaiming herself. She was taking back the pieces of her life that she had given up in the name of love. For the first time in years, Violet felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. The bus pulled into the station, and Violet stepped off, her feet unsteady but her resolve stronger than ever. She had a place to go now, shelter. Safety. Support. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this: she was going to fight for her life. She was going to rebuild. She wasn't going to let the darkness of her past define her. Inside the shelter, Violet found a warm, welcoming space where the staff helped her with the next steps. They connected her with legal aid, they helped her file for a restraining order, and, most importantly, they listened to her. For the first time in years, Violet felt heard. She felt seen. And though the road ahead would be difficult, she no longer had to walk it alone. She had found the courage to face the truth, to leave behind the life that had suffocated her, and now she had a community that would help her rebuild. But even as she began to find some sense of peace, a dark cloud hung over her. Ryan was still out there. He hadn't just disappeared. Violet couldn't forget the last words he had shouted at her, the rage in his voice, the twisted obsession that still lingered in him. She knew that this wasn't over. She knew that Ryan might not let her go so easily. But she was ready. She had taken back control, and she would never go back. As Violet sat in the quiet of her new room, she thought about everything she had gone through to get here. The fear, the pain, the shame, it all seemed like a distant memory now. But it was still a part of her, a part that would shape her into the woman she would become. And while she wasn't sure exactly what her future held, she knew one thing for certain: she was going to be okay. She would heal. She would grow. But the scars, the memories, the pain, those things would always be with her. It was part of the journey. It was part of her story. And in time, maybe she would find peace with that. Violet's journey may have started with the brutal reality of abuse, but it's clear that her story doesn't end here. The road to healing is long and filled with uncertainty, but with each step, she gets closer to the life she deserves. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think of Violet's decision to leave? Was it the right choice, or do you think there could have been another way? How do you feel about the emotional roller coaster she's been through? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your support, or your own story. Your voice matters, and together, we can create a conversation about healing and empowerment.